shed. In a footnote, the translator explains the term duga is a curved frame fitted with bells which surmounts the collar in a Russian harness. " If the little sledge, then the little sledge," he remarked, and proceeded to back the clever little animal into the shafts, it pretending meanwhile to bite him, and with the other man's assistance to harness it to the vehicle. When all was ready and there remained only the reins to be put on, Nikita sent his assistant to the stable for some straw, and then to the storehouse for a sack. " There now, that will do," said Nikita as he stuffed into the sledge the freshly cut oaten straw which the man had brought. " But nay, nay," he said to Brownie, " you need not prick your ears like that. Well, suppose we put the straw so, and the sack on top of it. Then it will be comfortable for you to sit upon." And he suited the action to the words by tucking the edges of the sack under the straw disposed around the seat. " Thank you, my boy," he added to the cook's husband. " 2 pairs of hands work quicker than one." After that he buckled the loose ends of the reins together, mounted the splashboard, and drove the good little steed, all impatient to be off, across the frozen dung of the yard to the entrance gates. " Uncle Makeet! Uncle Makeet! " came the shrill little voice of a 7-year-old boy from behind him as the youngster ran hastily out of the porch into the yard, a youngster who was dressed in a short jacket of black fur, new white bast shoes, and a cozy cap. " Let me get up too," he implored, fastening his jacket as he ran. " Well, well, come here then, my dear," said Nikita, pulling him up. Then, seating the master's pale, thin little son behind him, he drove the boy, beaming with pleasure, out into the street. It was now 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and freezing hard, the thermometer registering only 10 degrees. Yet the weather was dull and gusty, and fully half the sky was covered by a low, dark bank of cloud. In the courtyard the air was still, but directly one stepped into the street outside, the wind became more noticeable, and the snow could be seen twirling itself about in wreaths as it was swept from the roof of a neighbouring outbuilding into the corner near the bath-house. Hardly had Nikita returned through the gates and turned the cob's head towards the steps when Vassili Andreitch, a cigarette between his lips and a sheepskin coat upon his shoulders, fastened tightly and low down with a belt, came out of the house door and upon the high, snow-trampled flight of steps, making them creak loudly under his felt boots as he did so. Drawing the last whiff from his cigarette, he threw down the fag end and stamped it out. Then, puffing the smoke out of his moustache, he glanced at the cob as it re-entered the gates, and began to turn out the corners of his coat collar in such a way that the fur should be next to his face on either side. His face was clean-shaven except for the moustache, and yet not liable to be fouled with his breath. " So you have managed it, you little monkey! " he exclaimed as he caught sight of his little boy seated in the sledge. Vassili was a little animated with the wine which he had been drinking with his guests, and therefore the more ready to approve of all that belonged to him and all that he had done in life. The aspect of his little son at that moment, of the little boy whom he intended to be his heir, afforded him the greatest satisfaction, as he stood blinking at him and grinning with his long teeth. In the porch behind Vassili stood his pale, thin wife, Vassilia Andreitcha. She was enceinte, and had her head and shoulders muffled up in a woolen shawl so that only her eyes were visible. " Had not you better take Nikita with you? " she said, stepping timidly forward from the porch. Vassili returned her no answer, but merely frowned angrily, as though somehow displeased at her words, and spat upon the ground. " You see you will be travelling with money on you," she continued in the same anxious tone. " Besides, the weather might grow worse." " Don't I know the road, then, that I must needs have a guide with me? " burst out Vassili with that unnatural stiffening of his lips which marked his intercourse with buyers and sellers when he was particularly desirous of enunciating each syllable distinctly. " Yes, do take him, for heaven's sake, I implore you," repeated his wife, as she shifted her shawl to protect the other side of her face. " Goodness! Why, you stick to me like a bathing towel! " cried Vassili. " Where can I find room for him on the sledge? "" I am quite ready to go," put in Nikita cheerfully. " Only someone else must feed the other horses while I am away "— this last to his mistress. " Yes, yes, I will see to that, Nikita," she replied. " I will tell Simon to do it." " Then I am to go with you, Vassili Andreitch? " said Nikita expectantly. " Well, I suppose I must humour the good lady," answered Vassili. " Only, if you go, you had better put on a rather better, not to say warmer, diplomatist's uniform than that." And he smiled and winked one eye at Nikita's fur jacket, which, truth to tell, had holes under its two arms, down the back, and round the sides, besides being greasy, matted, shorn of hooks, and torn into strips around the edges. " Here, my good fellow, come and hold the cob, will you? " shouted Nikita across the yard to the cook's husband. " No, no, let me do it! " cried the little boy, drawing his small, red, frozen hands out of his pockets and catching hold of the chilly reins. " Don't be too long over your new uniform, please," said Vassili to Nikita with a grin. " No, no, Vassili Andreitch, I shan't be a moment," protested Nikita as he went shuffling hurriedly off in his old felt boots towards the servants' quarters across the yard. " Now then, my good Arininshka, give me my khalat from the stove. I am going with master," shouted Nikita as he burst into the hut and seized his belt from a peg. And here in a footnote the translator describes a khalat as a kind of frock coat. The cook, who had been enjoying a good sleep after dinner and was now getting tea ready for her husband, greeted Nikita cheerfully, and, catching the infection of his haste, began to bustle about briskly as he himself. First she took from the stove a shabby but well-aired cloth khalat and set about shaking and smoothing it out with all possible speed. " You are far more fit to go with master than I am," he said to the cook, in accordance with his usual habit of saying something civil to everyone with whom he came in contact. Then, twisting about him the shabby, well-worn belt, he succeeded first in compressing his not over-prominent stomach, and then in drawing the belt with great effort over his fur coat. " There you are," he said, not to the cook, but to the belt, as he tucked its ends in. " You can't very well burst apart like that." Then, with a hoist and much heaving of the shoulders, he drew the cloth khalat over all, stretching its back well to give looseness in the arms, and patted it into place under the armpits. Finally he took his mittens from a shelf. " Now," said he, " I am all right." " But you have forgotten about your feet," cried the cook. " Those boots are awful." Nikita stopped, as if struck by this. " Yes, perhaps I ought to change," he began, but changed his mind, and exclaiming, " No, he might go without me if I did. I have not far to walk," bolted off into the yard. " But won't you be cold in that khalat only, Nikita? " said his mistress when he reached the sledge. " No, indeed. How should I? It is very warm," answered Nikita, as he disposed the straw over the forepart of the sledge in such a manner as would conceal his feet after he had mounted, and thrust the whip, not needed for so willing a steed, under the straw. Vassili had already taken his seat, his broad back, with its double covering of furs, filling almost the entire rear part of the sledge. Then, taking up the reins, he flicked the cob with them while Nikita jumped into the forepart of the sledge just as it started, and sat leaning forward to the left and sticking out one leg. This ends part 1.